they say the hills remember. That every root, every stone, every breath of wind carries the echo of what the earth has eaten. In the Ozark Mountains of 1892, that memory had a name, the Hollow. A patch of land no map would claim, where fog never lifted and even the birds fell silent by dusk. It was said the Hollow didn't just keep secrets, it collected them. And that's where 32 men walked in and never walked out. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the stories that history tried to bury. No one remembered exactly when the disappearances began, only that the first man was a woodcutter named Thomas Reddick. His axe was found sunk deep into a tree, the handle slick with dew, or perhaps with something thicker. His boots were neatly placed beside it, as though he'd undressed before vanishing into the soil. Then came a drifter, then a surveyor, then a pair of brothers looking for gold. All gone. Each time the same detail, the ground looked freshly turned though no grave was found. By the autumn of 1892, the town of Fairvale whispered the Hollow's name like a prayer best left unanswered. Children were told not to stray past the creek. Men carried crucifixes or whiskey flasks when passing the ridge. Women drew curtains tighter at night, saying the mist from the mountains made the dreams too loud. At the center of every rumor were the Venn sisters, Ada and Mercy. They lived on the old Whitlock property, 3 miles into the fog, in a house that leaned like it was tired of standing. No man had set foot there in years. Some claimed they were widows. Others said they were never married but had taken lovers and buried them when the love soured. Their faces were rarely seen in daylight. They came to town only for salt and linen, and sometimes to sell jars of strange salves that healed wounds faster than reason allowed. There were stories, of course, stories that the sisters spoke to the earth, that they bled in the fields and whispered names into the soil. But in a town built on superstition and Sunday sermons, such things were said of many. Until the night the Hollow sang. It began with a sound no one could quite name. A low hum rising through the trees, like the voice of the mountain itself. Dogs whined. The church bell trembled without a hand to move it. And then, silence so deep it felt alive. By morning, 3 men who'd gone searching for the lost surveyors hadn't returned. Their horses wandered back alone, eyes rolling, sides flecked with mud that smelled of sulfur. Sheriff Elgin Cobb, a man built from oak and sin, took it upon himself to investigate. He gathered 4 others, men too proud or too foolish to listen to fear, and rode out at dawn. By sunset, only Cobb returned, his face white as ash, his left hand missing. He spoke no words that made sense, only muttered one thing again and again: they were singing. He died 2 days later. After that, Fairvale stopped pretending the Hollow was just another patch of cursed ground. They fenced off the trail, burned the bridge across the creek, and sealed their prayers with silence. But silence has a way of breeding curiosity, and curiosity was how the story of the Ozark sisters truly began. In January of 1893, a stranger arrived on horseback, a man named Elias Northwood, a writer for a traveling gazette that published tales of the bizarre and unexplained. He'd heard whispers of Fairvale's breeding cellar, of missing men and singing earth, and he wanted the truth, or at least something that could be sold as truth. He carried with him only a satchel, a revolver, and the arrogance of someone who didn't believe in ghosts. Elias stayed at the town inn where the owner, old Mrs. Lauren, warned him not to go near the ridge. She told him the story as best as she knew it, that Ada and Mercy Venn were born under the blood moon of 1849, daughters of a midwife accused of witchcraft but never tried. Their mother was said to have healed barren women, and cursed their husbands. When she died, the sisters inherited not just her land, but her reputation. And reputations, Mrs. Lauren whispered, tend to grow teeth in these parts. Elias smiled, thanked her, and wrote every word in his notebook. The next morning he walked toward the Hollow. The forest thickened with every step. The air smelled wrong, like wet iron and something sweet rotting underneath. Trees leaned too close together, their branches knitting into shapes that looked almost human. He saw a crow, wings mangled, hanging from a branch by a strip of cloth. He stopped, breath shallow. Then he noticed something else, footprints. Bare, small, leading toward the slope. And at the base of the hill, the house. It was older than he imagined, its roof slouched, its porch veiled in vines. But there was smoke curling from the chimney, thin and white, as though the house itself was exhaling. Elias hesitated. The wind pressed cold fingers down his neck. But a story was a story, and stories he'd learned don't write themselves. He knocked twice. A voice answered, soft as dust. "You've come far, Mr. Northwood. Come in before the fog gets you." He froze. He hadn't given his name. The door opened on its own. Inside, the house smelled of lavender and ashes. Candles flickered along the walls, their wax running in shapes like veins. 2 women stood at the end of the hall. Ada was tall and pale, her hair the color of milk. Mercy was shorter, with dark curls that fell across her eyes. They smiled, not warmly but knowingly. Elias introduced himself, saying he was a journalist researching the disappearances. The sisters exchanged a look as if sharing a thought. Ada spoke first. Men go missing everywhere, Mr. Northwood. Some just go deeper than others. He tried to laugh but his throat was dry. And the cellar? He asked. Mercy tilted her head. You've heard about our cellar? Elias nodded. She smiled. Then you must see it. A gust of wind blew through the house, extinguishing half the candles. The hallway darkened and somewhere below, a door creaked open, not from hinges but from something that breathed. The hollow had waited long enough. Elias followed Mercy and Ada down a narrow corridor lit by flickering candles that burned with a strange blue flame. The walls were lined with faded portraits, faces blurred, eyes scratched out, and names erased by age or intent. Each footstep echoed longer than it should have, as if the house remembered every sound that had ever touched it. The deeper they went, the colder the air became, until Elias could see his breath drifting through the candlelight like a spirit too fragile to stay. At the base of the stairs, the wooden boards gave way to stone. A single iron door stood before them, its surface etched with symbols Elias didn't recognize, circles, lines, and something that looked disturbingly like a rib cage. Mercy reached into her apron and withdrew a small key, but she didn't use it. Instead, she pressed her palm to the door. The metal hissed and the lock clicked open almost eagerly. She turned to him, eyes steady. What you see here, you write at your own risk. He wanted to laugh, to call her dramatic, but her voice was too calm, too absolute. He nodded instead, clutching his notebook tighter. Inside, the cellar stretched far wider than the house above it. It was not a cellar but a chamber, arched, breathing, alive. The walls glistened as though damp, but when Elias touched one, it felt warm, pulsing faintly beneath his fingers. Rows of long tables filled the room, each covered with glass jars. Inside them floated things that were not quite animals and not quite human. The flicker of the lantern revealed limbs too small, eyes too large, spines curled like question marks. He stumbled backward, bile rising in his throat. What is this? Ada answered softly, what the earth gives back when you ask too much of it. She walked ahead, her voice echoing off the stone. Our mother was a midwife. She delivered life into a world that didn't want it. When men refused to care for their women, when they took what they wanted and left them hollow, she found another way. Life from death. Flesh from flesh. The soil remembers blood, Mr. Northwood. It grows things when fed properly. Elias's mind reeled. He told himself it was a trick, that these were remnants of experiments or miscarriages preserved in alcohol. But the longer he looked, the less certain he became. The creatures in the jars seemed aware, their eyelids fluttering in slow motion, like something caught between dream and waking. 32 men, he whispered. What did you do with them? Mercy's smile was almost kind. We didn't take them. The land did. But it doesn't eat without purpose. She led him to the far end of the chamber, where the floor dipped into a pit lined with red earth. The smell of iron and decay thickened until he had to cover his mouth. Shapes lay in the dirt, some whole, some broken, some moving ever so slightly. One lifted its head, eyes pale as moonlight, lips forming words Elias couldn't bear to hear. Ada's voice floated through the dark. They came for pleasure. They stayed for the harvest. He turned to run, but the door behind him had closed. The keyhole glowed faintly red. Mercy stepped closer. You write stories, don't you? Tales of fear and curiosity. But what happens when curiosity becomes hunger? When the need to see becomes the need to have? I didn't, his voice cracked. I'm not like them. Ada tilted her head. Not yet. The cellar began to hum, a low vibration that traveled up his spine. The jars trembled on their shelves. From the pit, the soil stirred, forming small ridges that rose and fell like breathing. Whispered voices echoed through the chamber, not words but fragments of prayers twisted backward. Elias stumbled toward the door, slamming his fists against it. Let me out. Mercy's tone was gentle, almost maternal. You're already out. You just haven't realized where you've gone. He turned, panting. The cellar was no longer what it had been. The walls shifted, stretching, the stone melting into damp, root-covered flesh. The ceiling vanished into darkness. The sisters' faces blurred, their outlines smearing into the air like smoke. Elias's knees buckled. The air thickened. He felt something move beneath the floor, pressing upward. The hum grew louder until it was all he could hear. And in that sound, beneath the pulse of the house, he thought he could make out voices, male voices, begging, calling names that weren't theirs anymore. Then silence. Ada's voice came from somewhere behind him. The men who built this land took everything from us. The least we could do was take them back. Mercy's hand brushed his shoulder, her touch cold as stone. Now you've seen Mr. Northwood. And once the land shows you its secret, it doesn't forget you. When he blinked, the cellar was gone. He was standing on the porch in daylight, the wind stirring the tall grass. His horse waited by the fence, eyes wide, hooves shifting nervously. The sisters were nowhere in sight. Elias looked down. His notebook was gone. His hands were covered in red soil. He mounted his horse and rode hard until the town came into view. When he reached the inn, Mrs. Loring gasped at the sight of him. He was pale, trembling, his clothes torn. She pressed him for answers, but he could only whisper one sentence before collapsing to the floor. They grow men in the earth. For 3 days, Elias drifted in and out of fevered sleep, muttering the same words again and again. When he awoke, the sheriff's deputy was waiting with questions and a warrant. The sisters' house had been burned to the ground by townsfolk in the night. Nothing remained but blackened soil, and one jar half buried in the ashes, its contents still breathing. By the time Elias regained enough strength to stand, the whole town of Calico Ridge was whispering about the Ozark sisters. Some said they were witches. Others swore they were healers who'd turned to darkness after the war took their kin. The only thing everyone agreed on was that no one should ever have gone up to that hollow. Sheriff Camden knocked on Elias's door the morning after the fire, his hat low, his jaw hard. He was a tall man with a scar that ran from temple to chin, a reminder, people said, of the last time he'd crossed something unnatural. He looked Elias up and down, taking in the man's trembling hands and the dark stains under his fingernails. "You went up there?" Camden said quietly. "Tell me what you saw." Elias hesitated. His voice came out hoarse. "You wouldn't believe me." The sheriff leaned forward. "Son, 32 men have gone missing from these hills in 5 years. Their boots found by the creek. Their horses wandering back without riders. I'll believe anything that gives their families peace." Elias took a slow breath. "Then you'd better sit down." He told him everything, the cellar, the jars, the red soil that pulsed like skin. He left nothing out. When he was done, Camden didn't speak for a long while. The clock ticked behind them like a heartbeat. Finally, the sheriff rose. "We burned it last night. The whole ridge went up. But fire don't kill what's already dead wrong." "What do you mean?" Elias asked. Camden's gaze shifted toward the window where the morning fog clung to the fields. "You'll see soon enough." They rode out that afternoon with 6 men and a wagon of kerosene. When they reached the hollow, the air was thick with the smell of smoke and something sweeter, something rotting. The house was gone, reduced to charred beams and ash. But the ground beneath it had not blackened. It had bubbled. The earth itself looked blistered, like flesh after scalding water. Flies swarmed the air. "Lord have mercy," one of the men whispered. "What kind of fire does that?" Elias dismounted, his stomach twisting. The soil was still warm. Steam rose from the cracks, carrying a metallic scent he recognized too well. He crouched and brushed his fingers across the dirt. Beneath the ash something moved. He froze. Then the ground gave a shudder. A pale hand broke through the surface. Human but slick with a film of red clay. The fingers clawed weakly, grasping for air. The men shouted, stumbling backward. One of them raised his rifle. "Hold!" Camden barked. They watched in horror as more hands emerged, 5, 10, a dozen, reaching up from the soil like crops sprouting in fast motion. The bodies that followed were wrong, their skin mottled with mud, their eyes clouded white. Some wore remnants of flannel shirts and miners' belts. Elias felt bile rise in his throat. He recognized one of them, the preacher's son who'd vanished the winter before. The creatures groaned, low and mournful, as if remembering what pain was. Then one opened its mouth, and the sound that came out was not human. The men fired. The bullets tore through flesh and clay alike, but the things didn't fall. They staggered, swaying as if tethered by roots to the earth beneath. "Back to the wagon," Camden yelled. "Burn it again." They poured kerosene across the soil, hands shaking, the stench thick as tar. Elias struck a match, his fingers trembling. For a heartbeat he hesitated, then dropped it. The flames raced like lightning, consuming everything. The groans rose into shrieks. One of the burning figures lurched toward him, arms outstretched, and in its eyes Elias saw not hatred but recognition. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered through blackened lips. The fire roared, swallowing the sound. When the smoke cleared, Nothing remained but a crater of glassy earth. The sheriff stood silently, his face gray. "This place ain't right," he said at last. "Whatever they planted here, it's rooted deep." Elias looked down. At the edge of the pit, something glimmered. He knelt and pulled it free, a silver locket, half melted, engraved with the initials M.A., Mercy Ada. He pocketed it before anyone saw. That night, the town held a prayer vigil. The preacher spoke of sin and deliverance, of women who'd tempted darkness and paid the price. But as Elias watched the flames of the candles flicker, he couldn't shake the sound of that voice from his head. "You shouldn't have come." 2 days later, strange things began happening in Calico Ridge. Livestock went missing. Wells turned red at dawn. And at the edge of the fields, men swore they heard singing, soft, feminine, and terribly familiar. Elias began to dream of the cellar. In his dreams, the jars were still there, each one cracked open. He saw faces pressing against glass from the inside, lips mouthing his name. He stopped sleeping altogether. He stopped writing too. But one night, driven by a force he couldn't explain, he opened the locket. Inside was not a picture, but a small piece of parchment, covered in faded writing. "The earth remembers every promise broken." He snapped it shut, heart pounding. Outside his window the wind shifted. It carried a sound that didn't belong in any ordinary night, the slow, deliberate hum of two voices in harmony. Mercy and Ada. He stepped to the window, breath fogging the glass. In the moonlight, he saw two figures standing at the edge of the field, hands clasped, faces pale as milk. They didn't move. They only watched. Elias staggered back, knocking over his lamp. The room plunged into darkness. When he looked again, they were gone. But the ground beneath his cabin was damp, and the soil on his floor was red. By the next moon, Calico Ridge was a town in mourning. The sheriff's men patrolled by lantern light, though every night their ranks grew thinner. The wind that swept through the hollow now carried the stench of something sweet and spoiled. Crops withered overnight. The creeks foamed red as if the earth itself bled from unseen wounds. And through it all, the singing continued. Faint, feminine, melodic, heard just beyond the fields where fog moved like slow breath. Elias tried to keep to himself. He boarded his windows, nailed shut the cellar door, and refused every visitor. The people said he'd gone mad after what happened in the hollow. Some claimed he'd brought a curse back with him. They weren't wrong. It began with the soil. Every morning he'd find it freshly tilled outside his door, as if someone had been digging. At first he thought it was animals. Then one morning he found footprints, bare, small, and parallel, as though two people had stood watching him sleep through the walls. He started keeping a lamp burning through the night. But it didn't matter. When he woke, the flame was always out and the footprints were closer. One night, desperate, Elias rode to Sheriff Camden's house. The old lawman sat alone at his table, gun in hand, bottle of rye beside it. His eyes were sunken, his skin gray from sleeplessness. "I see them too," Camden muttered before Elias could speak. "Two women. Always together. Always humming that damn tune." He pushed the bottle across the table. "They come for the ones who burned them. You lit the match, didn't you?" Elias nodded weakly. "Then they'll come for you first." Outside, thunder rolled low across the mountains. The lamps flickered, and in the momentary dark, Elias thought he saw two silhouettes behind the window glass, one tall, one slight, hands pressed to the pane. When the light returned, they were gone, but the frost where they'd touched formed two perfect handprints. That night, Camden's house caught fire. The townsfolk said lightning struck it. But Elias knew better. He watched from the ridge as the flames licked high, and through the smoke he saw two pale figures standing side by side, watching it burn. The next morning he found a note pinned to his door. The parchment was wet, smeared with what looked like rust or blood. 3 words written in delicate script: "The harvest begins." He tried to leave Calico Ridge. He packed a bag, saddled his horse, and rode west until the trees thinned. But no matter how far he went, the landscape didn't change. The same crooked oak, the same bend in the creek, the same broken fence post. By dusk he was back where he'd started, standing before his own cabin. It was then he realized, the hollow wasn't gone. It had spread. The land itself was folding in on him. That night the singing grew louder. Not from the fields this time, but from beneath the floorboards. He tore them up one by one until his hands bled. Beneath the wood, the soil pulsed red and wet like a heartbeat. A voice rose from below, soft, tender, almost loving. "You kept her locket." Elias froze. "You burned our home." A second voice joined, the two now harmonizing in a low, mournful melody that made the air tremble. "Now we'll build one under yours." He stumbled back, grabbing his lantern. "Stay away from me," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean to." The flame guttered. The room dimmed. From the dark soil, a pale arm emerged, followed by another. The floorboards splintered as two figures climbed through, faces smooth and glistening, eyes black and bottomless. Mercy and Ada. But their forms were no longer human. Their skin shimmered faintly like the surface of water, and their hair hung in strings wet with clay. They smiled with the calm of saints and the hunger of wolves. "You took our song," Ada whispered. "You buried our kin," Mercy breathed. They reached for him. He swung the lantern wildly and the oil spilled, igniting the room in a sheet of flame. The sisters didn't flinch. Fire danced across their faces without burning them. They stepped closer and Elias felt the heat sear his lungs. He ran through the door and into the night, the forest alive with whispers. Everywhere he turned he saw eyes, dozens of them, glinting from the trees. The men from the cellar. The ones who'd vanished. Their mouths moved in unison, repeating one line over and over in low, broken tones. "The harvest begins. The harvest begins." Elias fled toward the ridge, smoke curling after him. When he reached the hollow, it was no longer empty. Where the house once stood, a new structure had risen, built from bones and branches, glowing faintly from within. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay. And at its heart he saw something impossible. A cradle. Inside it, wrapped in blood-stained linen, lay a small, breathing child. Mercy and Ada stood beside it, hands intertwined. Their faces softened as Elias approached, though their eyes still burned with ancient grief. "This is the last one," Mercy said. "The child of what you planted." "I didn't," Elias began, but his words failed him. The infant stirred, and when its eyes opened, they were his own. Ada smiled faintly. "The earth remembers every promise broken." He fell to his knees, trembling. "What do you want from me?" Mercy reached down, brushing his cheek with a cold hand. "To finish the song." The wind rose, carrying their melody through the valley, low, steady, endless. The child's cries joined the tune until the sound became something vast, inhuman, eternal. The next morning, the people of Calico Ridge found Elias's cabin reduced to ash. The ground where it had stood was turned as if freshly plowed, and in the center grew a single vine bearing two pale flowers. By harvest season, no one remained in the town. By autumn, Calico Ridge had vanished from the county records. No mail route stopped there, no trains passed, and no preacher dared to speak its name from the pulpit. What remained of it was swallowed by ivy, rot, and silence. Yet sometimes, on nights when the wind blew east, travelers swore they could hear faint singing drifting through the trees, a woman's voice in harmony with her sister's, tender and terrible. The last witness to what truly happened was a man named Jonah Vale, a surveyor sent from Jackson to map the unclaimed lands of the Ozark border. He arrived at what should have been Calico Ridge on an afternoon thick with heat and stormlight. His horse balked at the edge of town, refusing to cross the bridge. Jonah dismounted and walked the rest of the way, boots sinking into soft red mud. He found the ruins first, stone chimneys jutting from the ground like broken teeth, and fences twisted by some unseen hand. The air was still, but the trees creaked as if they were breathing. In the center of it all stood the field, vast, level and golden with dying corn. At its far edge rose the black skeleton of a house, or what once had been one. Jonah called out, his voice cracking in the emptiness. No answer. Only the faint rustle of stalks. Then, beneath that, something quieter, like the hum of a lullaby. He couldn't tell where it came from. It seemed to move, circling him slowly. He followed the sound toward the house. Each step sank deeper into the soil, damp and warm. The smell rose, iron, ash, and something sweeter. He reached the porch and saw that the boards were new. Too new. As though someone had built over what was already there. Inside he found a single room. No furniture, no tools. Only a cradle at the center, rocking gently though there was no wind. Jonah froze. His pulse thundered in his ears. He whispered, "Is someone here?" The cradle stopped. The air shifted. Then came a voice, low and close behind him. They sang to him until he slept. He spun around. No one. Only shadows pooling near the corners. The voice again from another direction now. They buried him where the roots meet the river. Jonah's breath fogged though the room was stifling hot. He stepped backward, knocking over the cradle. It fell with a dull thud, spilling dirt and something pale, too small to be human, too shaped to be anything else. Then the floorboards began to hum. He stumbled for the door, but it slammed shut as if struck from the outside. The humming grew louder, voices overlapping, words twisting into rhythm. He recognized the phrase, though he didn't know why. The harvest begins. He clawed at the latch. Wood splintered. And then he saw them, two women standing in the doorway that wasn't there a moment before. One held her head high, eyes dark as coal. The other smiled faintly, her hair falling in wet ropes over her shoulders. Their dresses were torn, their skin pale as milk. Jonah stammered, I didn't mean to trespass. Mercy tilted her head. You did. Ada stepped closer, her voice almost kind. But everyone does, sooner or later. He tried to speak again, but the words died when he looked into their eyes. There was something inside them, something like an entire field burning in silence. Mercy reached toward him. Tell them what you saw. He backed away, shaking. Who? Those who still believe the land is theirs. Before he could answer, the world shifted. The house dissolved into mist, and he was standing in the middle of the field again. The corn rustled, though there was no wind. All around him, figures rose from the soil, dozens of them, men, women, and children, their faces gray with dust, their mouths moving in perfect unison. The hymn continued, steady and sorrowful. We plowed the earth. We fed the flame. Now let them reap what they became. Jonah dropped to his knees, pressing his hands to his ears. The song didn't stop. It crawled under his skin, vibrating through his bones. When he opened his eyes, the field was no longer gold, it was red. Each stalk bled from the tip, dripping onto his boots. And through that crimson haze, he saw Elias standing at the far end of the rows. Alive, or something close to it. His face was white as wax, his clothes blackened by soot. In his hands he held a scythe. Jonah called out, but Elias didn't answer. He only began to walk, dragging the blade through the field. Wherever it passed, the corn folded flat, whispering in voices that weren't the wind. The sisters appeared behind him, watching. Ada's hand rested on Elias's shoulder. Mercy smiled, her teeth too sharp in the light. The harvest begins, she said softly. Jonah ran. He didn't remember how he reached the road, or how the sun managed to rise again. He only remembered the sound, the hymn still playing faintly behind him. By the time he returned to Jackson, his hair had gone gray at the temples. When he told his story, they dismissed him as fevered. But 3 months later, the map he'd drawn was found in his office. It showed no sign of Calico Ridge, only a black field marked with 2 initials intertwined, M and A. That same night, the clerk who found it swore he heard singing through the walls. They said the land healed itself. By 1896, a decade after the last scream had vanished from Calico Ridge, the forest had crept back over the ruins. Vines curled through window frames. Oaks rose where houses once stood. Wildflowers pushed through ash. To travelers passing by, it was nothing but another forgotten patch of southern wilderness. But those who lingered swore that the soil whispered if you stayed too long. The first to settle there again was a widow named Clara Wexler. She was 42, thin as a branch, and quiet in the way only grief can make someone quiet. Her husband had died in a mining collapse 2 counties over, and she had nowhere else to go. When the land agent in Jackson told her the old Calico plot was free, used to be a small farming town burned down in the storm of '85, she took it without hesitation. When she arrived, the air was sweet with decay and honeysuckle. She found an old brick foundation beside the stream and built her cabin over it. Within weeks, the grass returned, green and tall. The birds came next. Then came the dreams. The first one was simple, a field at dusk, golden and endless, with 2 women standing at its center. One was brushing the other's hair, singing something too soft to hear. Clara woke with her heart hammering and a taste of soot in her mouth. The next morning she found a shovel leaning against her porch. She hadn't put it there. A note was nailed to the handle, just a single word written in faded ink. Plant. She thought it a prank. But something in her, something older than reason, urged her to obey. So she went to the patch of ground behind her house and began to dig. The soil was rich, black, and damp. The deeper she dug, the more it smelled like iron. She planted tomatoes, beans, and sweet peas. Within a week, they had sprouted impossibly fast. Within 2, they bore fruit. Neighbors who visited said she had a miracle garden. Clara only smiled, but she noticed the roots. They grew thicker than they should have, twisting together beneath the dirt like fingers laced in prayer. At night, she began hearing voices through her window. Women's voices. Sometimes they laughed, soft and distant. Sometimes they sang. Once, she could have sworn she heard her own name whispered among them. Then the dreams deepened. The 2 women returned, Mercy and Ada, though Clara didn't yet know their names. They stood closer now, their faces clearer. Mercy's smile was kind but wrong, the way candlelight flickers just before it goes out. Ada's eyes were full of something, sorrow or hunger Clara couldn't tell. In the dream they asked her to tend the garden, to keep the roots alive, to water them even when the rain stopped. Clara agreed. When she woke, her hands were coated in dirt. She told herself she was sleepwalking, that grief made her see things. But the next time she dug to plant new seeds, she found bone. Not animal bone, small, delicate, curved like a child's rib. She dropped it, stumbled backward, heart pounding. For the rest of that day she refused to look at the garden. But by sunset, the flowers there had bloomed larger than ever, blood-red blossoms with petals shaped like open mouths. And the soil beneath them moved. That night she locked the door, bolted the shutters, and lit 3 candles. The light shook. Outside, wind howled through the trees. She tried to pray, but the words turned to ash on her tongue. Then from the garden came a sound. It was the same song from her dreams, low, mournful, but beautiful. It drifted through the walls like perfume. Her hands trembled. Against her will, she rose, crossed the room, and unlatched the window. The garden glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. 2 shapes stood among the flowers. "Clara," Mercy said, voice like silk dragged across stone. "You've done well." Clara's breath caught. What are you?" Ada stepped forward. Her eyes gleamed wet in the moonlight. "Keep planting," she whispered. "The field isn't full yet." Clara shook her head. "No. I don't want any part of this." Mercy tilted her head, almost pitying. "You already are." The earth shifted and something rose from the soil, hands. Dozens of them, pale and glistening, reaching toward the surface. They didn't grab her. They only pressed upward as though begging to be pulled free. Clara screamed, slamming the shutters closed. But she could still hear them, their nails scratching the wood, their voices blending into that same awful hymn. "We plowed the earth. We fed the flame. Now let them reap what they became." By dawn the noise stopped. When she dared look outside, the garden looked ordinary again. But in the sunlight she saw something new, the initials carved into her fence. Emine. From that day on, Clara never touched the soil again. The garden still grew without her care. And when travelers came through the region, they spoke of the widow's strange patch of land, where vegetables tasted like copper and flowers opened only under the moon. The sheriff who came to investigate vanished 3 days later. His horse was found near the ridge, its saddle empty, its bridle tangled in vines. Clara was last seen standing in her doorway, staring at the field as if waiting for someone. And from far below, deep in the roots of her garden, 2 women sang softly in perfect unison. They said the song could only be heard when the wind died, when even the trees held their breath. It began low, like the hum of distant bees, then grew clearer until the words took shape, strange and slow, as if dragged up from beneath the soil. No one in Calico Ridge had dared to go near that valley since Clara Wexler disappeared. Her house stood empty now, curtains fluttering like ghosts. But her garden still bloomed, redder and thicker every year. By 1901, locals had taken to calling it the Widow's Acre. Children whispered that if you knelt there at night, the ground would breathe back. Some said the earth pulsed with heat, like a sleeping animal. Others swore they saw faces in the roots, eyes open, watching. One night, a young preacher named Jonah Hale came riding through the valley. He'd heard the stories in every tavern between Jackson and Boone, tales of the Ozark sisters, of missing men, of women turned to legend by the devil's hand. He believed none of it. "Superstition is the devil's smoke," he'd said, tapping his Bible. "And I aim to clear the air." He reached the Wexler cabin just after sunset. The roof had caved in, ivy spilling through the rafters. The air was thick with the smell of wild roses and iron. His horse refused to step closer. So Jonah tied it to a post, took his lantern, and stepped into the clearing. The light touched the garden first. The flowers swayed though there was no wind. Their petals glistened as if slick with dew, but when Jonah bent down, he realized it wasn't water. It was something darker. The scent of blood mingled with the sweet rot of blossoms. He drew back, heart pounding. "Mercy," he whispered to himself, recalling the names the locals had muttered like a curse. "Ada. If this place is yours, I mean no harm." The earth stirred. At first it was faint, a tremor beneath his boots. Then it grew. The lantern flickered. A whisper drifted up from the soil. Not one voice. Many. "We are the soil," it said. "We are the harvest." Jonah stumbled back. The ground split open between the rows of flowers, a narrow wound revealing what lay beneath, roots thick as arms tangled around bones. Skulls, ribs, the curve of fingers clutching each other. And from among them 2 shapes began to rise. Their skin was pale as the moon, their hair black as cinders. They were not rotting. No, they were perfect, preserved, clothed in the same torn dresses they had died in. Mercy and Ada. The Ozark sisters. Mercy smiled first. You've come to pray? Jonah's voice broke. You should not walk. You should not speak. Ada stepped forward, her bare feet leaving no print in the soil. We were buried alive, she said softly. Our breath taken, our bodies burned, our names cursed. But they forgot. The earth remembers everything. Jonah held up the lantern like a weapon. You're not of God. Mercy tilted her head. No. But he watched. The flame inside the lantern shivered, then snuffed out. Darkness swallowed the clearing. In the pitch black, Jonah heard the whispering begin again, not just from the sisters but from beneath him. The voices of men. Dozens of them. Begging. Screaming. Praying. The ground convulsed. Jonah fell to his knees. Hands erupted from the soil, gray, half flesh, half root, grasping his arms, his legs, his throat. He screamed until the sound vanished under the weight of their voices. The sisters knelt beside him. Mercy pressed a hand against his chest. You'll feed the field now, she murmured. We all do in the end. When dawn came, the clearing was silent again. The garden gleamed wet with morning dew, and the preacher's Bible lay open beside the well, its pages turned crimson. Over the next months, new plants began to grow. Taller. Wilder. With thick roots and leaves shaped like open palms. The locals avoided the valley entirely, calling it cursed. But when storms came, the wind carried a sound from that hollow, a hymn too old to have words, sung by women long dead. And still the earth moved. One spring morning, a farmer's boy wandered too close and saw something that made him run until his lungs bled. He swore the vines had spelled something in the dirt. When his father returned to look, the letters were still there, curling through the roots like veins. It read Mercy. Clara. Jonah. Below that, a fifth name was forming. By the time they left, it was clear enough to read. Yours. The song rose again that night, louder than ever, echoing through the mountains until even the rivers seemed to hum. And those who heard it said it wasn't just music, it was the sound of the land remembering its dead. If this story lingered in your thoughts, let it live a little longer. Like and subscribe for more forgotten voices.